Okay, guys, on Friday we worked on we worked on factoring trinomials. We used the skill, the sum and product puzzle skill that we developed, and we were able to factor a quadratic, which this guy right here is a quadratic, x squared plus 2x, and then what they did was they moved the 15 over, so minus 15 equals 0. That's called a quadratic, all right? And we don't know how to solve that. I mean, if you had 2x plus 6 equals 0, you could solve that. You'd subtract 6, and then you'd have 2x equals negative 6. And then you go, all right, divide by 2, so x is going to be negative 3. That's pretty easy to solve, but there's no squared here or anything, okay? And we don't have any way to solve, come on. We don't have any way to solve something like this. So the easiest way to solve those that I'm going to show you is by factoring. We're going to create this situation here, okay? But let's review factoring first, and then we'll come back to this, okay? How do we solve this guy? Okay. No. So if we had that x squared plus 2x minus 15 equals 0. We're not going to worry about the 0 for now. We're just going to worry about this part again. And so we know we've got to have two parentheses, okay? And we know we're going to put the last number here and the middle number there, the middle term there. Now, there's a couple rules about negatives. If this top number here is negative, or in this case, if the last number is negative, then I have to have one of each sign in my parentheses. So I have to have an x plus, and I have to have an x minus, or vice versa. I could go x minus x plus. It doesn't matter. Same thing's going to happen here. I got to have a plus and minus here, right? So then we're looking at the factors of 15. Those are the only factors. So then, if I have to have one of each, I look at this sign to tell me the bigger one. So the bigger one, 5, has to be positive to make that positive. So the 3 would go here. So I would go 5, and I would go 3. So those are my two factors, x plus 5 and x minus 3. All right? Now, that's going to equal 0. We're going to come back to talk about that in a minute here, but let's do another practice on that. Let's go, yeah, I screwed up here. X squared minus, I don't know, I'm going to make something up here. Let's go 24, and let's go minus 11x, okay? So now this time, I got a 24 and a negative 11. If you remember, if this guy is positive, if this top term is positive, then the two factors that go in here have to be the same signs. And since this guy's negative, they both have to be negative. So I put a negative and a negative here already. All right, so now the factors of 24 that make 11. Well, it's got to be 3 and 8. So whenever this sign is positive, my two factors have to be the same sign. So it's going to be x minus 3 and x minus 8. Okay, if this had been a positive here, then they would both have been positive. Hopefully that makes sense. Whenever this sign is positive, whenever the last sign is positive, the two factors have to be the same sign. Okay? So if we had x squared minus 11x plus 24, they would be the same, x minus 3 and x minus 8. The minus signs in the parentheses are what I'm talking about is the same. Not the same as this guy, the same as each other. Okay? So that's a little trick there. So now let's talk about the idea. They don't really describe it here very well, I don't think. All right, let's go back. So the idea is, I don't know what to do. Here we go. I'm not sure how this video is going to show for you guys, because sometimes when I go back and forth, it doesn't do it. But anyway, here's what's going on. Let's go back to what we talked about a second ago. When we had 2x, oops, wow, I can't even write now. I'm all flustered. All right, so I had 2x plus 6 equals 0, right? And we solved that easily by moving that, right? And so basically, In other words, we're asking ourselves, what makes this 0? If I put a negative 3 in there, that would make that 0, wouldn't it? Okay, so if I look at this, what would make that 0? 3 would, right? 3 minus 3 would be 0. Or in other words, I could take and just solve it. X is 3. So in other words, it's the opposite of this. What's the opposite of this guy? Well, 3 is. So that makes 3 there. Now, does 3 work for this one? No. Okay, 3 doesn't make that 0. 3 makes that 8, right? But the deal is, only one of them has to be 0. So if I put 3 in, that would make this one 0. So 8 times 0, because we said this one would be 8, right? If I put a 3 here, that'd be 8. 8 times 0, that's still going to be 0, isn't it? So only one of these two things has to be 0. Let's talk about that some more. If I had 2x equals 0, well, x has to be 0, right? What if I had x times y equals 0? Do I know what x is? No. Do I know what y is? But one of them has to be 0, right? Either x is 0 or y equals 0 for that to be true. They could both be 0, or both, let's say that, but only one of them has to be. Does that make sense? Only one of them has to be 0, because when I'm multiplying them, 0 times anything is going to make it 0. So if we go back to this, x minus 3, the answer is 3. But what about this guy? What would make this one 0? Well, if I subtract the 5, x is negative 5. So those are my two answers. I have two answers, and they would both work. So if I go in here, x squared plus 2x minus 15 equals 0. If I plug in 3, let's see. 3 squared plus 2 times 3 minus 15 equals 0. So that's 9 plus 6. Look at that. That's 15. Minus 15 is, oh, not a 16. I'm sorry. Got ahead of myself. 15 minus 15 is 0, isn't it? And it would also work for negative 5. If I put a negative 5 in there, negative 5 squared plus 2 times negative 5 minus 15 equals 0. So that's negative 5 squared is going to be 25, positive 25, minus 10 minus 15. Guess what? That's negative 25, isn't it? Okay. We will probably talk about, well, I'll just talk about the significance of the equaling 0. This is a parabola. This graph is a parabola. It looks like that, one of those shapes, or like an upside down St. Louis arch, It's not really a parabola, but it looks like one. Okay. And the idea of the 0 is the solutions are where the parabola touches the x-axis. So if we had a graphing axis, and we had like this here, the solutions would be wherever this crosses, okay? And so for that one that we just did, it was negative 5 and 3, and so that parabola would look something like that. Okay, that's what's going on there. Because the x value, or the y value, is 0. The x value is 3 when y is 0. Okay, so if we're looking at that, when we would go to graph something, what they're doing is they're putting a 0 in for the y, right? If you remember graphing y equals 3x minus 6, we'd start at negative 6, blah, 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 and go up 3 over 1 and look something like that, right? Okay, the same thing when we're graphing parabolas. You got to have a y there, and so when y is 0, that means it's on this line, okay? All right, so there's more examples here you can look at, but basically, take a look at this again. The opposite of 30 is negative 30, and the opposite of negative 8 is positive 8. Okay, now in this case, read this right here. Since dimensions cannot be negative, negative 30 isn't a good answer, is it? I don't have a negative 30-foot board. There's no way it's going to happen. So if we're talking about some sort of length or dimension or time, you never have a negative answer. Only the positive ones will work. Okay? Like I can't have a negative 4-second run. It doesn't work that way. I can't go back in time. I wish I could, but I can't. Okay, so I don't have negative length boards and I don't have negative time. So whenever you're doing a problem like that, you only take your positive answers, okay? And let's look at this one real quick here. Adina has a 4x6 photograph. She wants to enlarge the photograph by increasing the length and width by the same amount. What dimensions of the large photograph? Oh, I don't want to do this. Never mind. Sorry about that. I thought this was going to be a factoring one, but we do need to practice some more factoring, so let's do that. Let's go here. Let's go x squared. Let's go minus 12 and plus x. Okay, so if we start here, we're going to have a negative 12 in the top, and we got a 1 there, right? Because there's a 1 here. And this negative right here means I got to have a plus and a minus. All right, well, factors of 12 has to be 4 and 3, right? Which one goes where? Well, this is positive, so my bigger factor has to be the positive one. So we would go x plus 4 and x minus 3. Now we've factored it. Now, if we have to solve it, then we just take one more step. We say, all right, what's the opposite of this? Well, negative 4. What's the opposite in here? 3. So negative 4 and 3 are my solutions. This is the factors. These are the factors. This is the factored answer. And these are the solutions. Okay? So today I'm still just going to have you, on the quick check, I'm just going to have you factor. But on the quizzes, sometimes they have some that say solve. So you'll have to go one more step, okay? And it'll be pretty apparent. They won't have these guys here like this in the parentheses. They'll just have answers, okay? When you have to do that. So let's try one more here, just to review what we've done. Well, let's try 32 here. So let's say, oh boy. Let's try that. Okay, and so, again, if it doesn't have an equals 0, it's just simply factoring, okay? I'm going to add that later, but if it doesn't have the equal 0, we don't have to solve. Okay, so I'm going to start with my 32. That's positive, so my factors have to have the same sign, right? But this is negative, so that tells me they're both going to be negative. All right, so I'm looking at my factors of 32 here. Ooh, right there, 4 and 8, right? So minus 4 and minus 8. So I got x minus 4 and x minus 8. And those are my factors, and I'm done. Okay, if I'm just factoring, that's all I got to do. Now, if they say, all right, solve it by factoring, well, then you just, well, what would make it 0? You don't really even have to add this in, but they usually will. But you just say, well, the opposite of this guy is 4. Opposite of negative 4 is 4. And the opposite of negative 8, is 8. So those would be my solutions. If I plugged in 4 into here and into here, it would give me 0. Or if I plugged in 8 there, it would give me 0. Okay, sometimes this won't be in the right order. Like that very first problem on the very first slide, we had something like this here, and it equaled 15. So when they do that to you, just get everything on the same side so it equals 0. You know, if we subtract the 15 here, which is what they did on that very first slide, now it equals 0, and we can factor it. So let's try one more. Let's do x squared minus 6x equals negative 18. Okay? So if I bring my 18 over, I have to add it, correct? So now I got x squared minus 6x plus 18 equals 0. Now I can factor this guy. So let's go here. Let's go 18 and negative 6. So this is positive. So both my factors have to be the same, and they have to be the same as this sign. That negative 6. So these both have to be negative. And I made one that's not factorable. So that was awesome. Good job, Mr. Goki. Because 1 times 18, 2 times 9, 3 times 6. That won't work. Nothing works, right? So we would say not factorable. I'm glad I did that because I hadn't really addressed that yet. Not everything is factorable. So I said this is the easiest way to solve quadratics, and it is. But you can't solve every quadratic by factoring because some of them aren't factorable. Okay, none of these would add to -6 or subtract to -6. Okay. What I should have done was put a -9 here, so let's do that. Let's go x squared minus 9x equals -18. So when I add the 18 this time, I get x squared minus 9x plus 18 equals 0. And so now it'll work, because that 3 and that 6, if I make them both negative, will give me the -9, won't they? And the negative times negative gives me the positive 18. So we can come over here, we go x minus 3 and x minus 6, or vice versa, it doesn't matter, x minus 6, x minus 3, wouldn't matter one bit. And so now we've factored it, and now to say the solutions, well, we just say x is the opposite of this number and the opposite of that number. And there's our solutions. Okay? So give this quick check a try for me. I'll put a quick check up in a little bit, and a quiz is later today. And the quizzes might have some of these. The quick check is only getting to this point here. Can you factor it? Okay? All right, let me know if you have questions.